Okay, let's go. Sorry we're a little bit late. Good morning and welcome to another edition of the Lean Focus monthly webinar series. This installment is entitled Procurement Transformation, the 8-element model to future-proof your supply chain. This presentation is confidential. We ask that you please do not share this with anyone other than yourself. In a minute, I will talk about how this can be made available for you to review at a later date. So let's talk about the logistics. All participants will be placed in listen only mode. There are some handouts that if you look at the GoToWebinar control panel, you can see handouts. There are two listed in the 2 of 5. There's a Procurement Transformation Practice handout, and then there is a self-assessment that you can do on your procurement function, which the speaker will cover what that looks like in detail. Those are made available to you during this presentation. So if you want to download those at some point while you're listening to the webinar, you can have those files available for you. If you have a question, I will be the moderator at the end for the speaker. So you can type your questions in the questions panel in the GoToWebinar control panel, and I will read those questions to the speaker at the end. So we will have probably about 10 or 15 minutes at the end to answer all your questions. And lastly, a audio recording, visual recording will be made of this webinar and will be emailed to you one day after the webinar concludes. Please make sure to check your spam folder just in case you do not receive that. So let me introduce the panelist, Rob Grumski. Rob, take it away.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to our European colleagues. My name is Rob Grumski. I have over 20 years of experience of developing, transforming, and leading global supply chain and procurement organizations across a variety of industry segments. I also have experience leading P&L for several divisions of companies, as well as leading sales and sales management across several industries as well. Next slide, please. So today we are going to talk about, we're going to introduce the Lean Focus Procurement Practice. We're also going to speak to Procurement Practice Rapid Assessment Process, which leads us to the transformation model, and then briefly about a case study. And as Damon mentioned, we'll hold the questions till the end of the presentation. Next slide. So here at Lean Focus, we focus on building high-performance cultures. We really want to have driven leaders who not only are experienced, but have a good set of knowledge around the lean tools and roll up their sleeves to get the things done that need to be done. We live by the guiding principles that we've cultivated around our 14 principles, and we use our proven systems to really drive our approach and get sustaining results. Next slide. We've helped numerous businesses transform themselves across many industry segments, as you can see here. And our lean practice around procurement focus does transpose across all industry segments and businesses. Next slide. So specifically around procurement transformation practice, which I lead here at Lean Focus, we're really looking to unleash the power of procurement in your organization. Procurement should have and should be a critical partner or business partner to the overall enterprise. And what we try to do is we will partner with you to bring out that power to become that valued partner within the organization that helps drive supply risk reduction, accelerates savings, improves our quality and your delivery across your supply chain. Next slide. So as we get into this, first, whenever we go into a situation to look at a particular client or potential client, we really want to understand where they are. And our goal is to really identify those opportunities where we can reduce supplier costs, improve quality, shorten delivery, and minimize supply chain risk. And we do this via our lean methodologies around problem solving, project management, and value stream mapping. The opportunities will be quantified and summarized into a transformation plan, and then we emphasize the ROI to use and the use of these tools. The client can select the projects to complete with lean focus support as needed, and we execute, again, as needed, problem solving, daily management, Kaizen workshops to drive improvement and build the organization muscle to sustain these results. Next slide. So what this procurement rapid assessment looks like and what it includes is, first of all, we like to look at what the team is actually doing. So we go through and provide a view of what the team is participating in procurement, and also functions that are surrounding procurement. We want to understand how many and who is doing tactical activities, which we have classified. And then also we want to understand who and how much time is being spent on strategic activities. Once we have a good understanding of that, then we'll move into looking at the benchmark metrics that we've established across many of our industry segments to kind of let you know where you are and where you stand around how that looks. Lastly, we will actually do an in-depth view of 8 attributes of procurement function and develop a maturity score around these 8 attributes. These attributes are well defined and really are, let's say, put you in a very good place to understand where you need to go to become a true partner to the business. Next slide. So, overall, that procurement rapid assessment is really identifying that problem. So we want to understand what problem to solve. We want to look at and map out the process and dissect the problem to understand how do we get to the right answer. We want to prioritize those solutions, and we do that through tri-storming and other methodologies. And then once we come to where we want to go, we want to instill standard processes, metrics for measuring the change, and an implementation plan and review cadence that allows for senior leadership and the procurement team to see the progress they're making. Building the process, implementing the process, and measuring the process is the data that drives the metrics. And we really want to drive those metrics to a place that adds value to the business. Next slide. So as we look at the assessment, it's really important not only to understand where you are, but also to take that and convert it into what do we want to focus on? Where are those gaps and where are we less than 50% versus an aspirational goal? And then we want to force rank those to be able to address those in a very methodical way to help us close the gaps. It's really important that those gaps be moved through the problem-solving process and develop the action plan to address them in a very distinct manner. Next slide. So the results of the rapid assessment will really come back to that transformation action plan. It'll be a meaty plan that has specific tasks and actions to take and ownerships and timelines that will put people to task to make sure we get done what we say we're going to get done. In addition to that, to support that action plan will be a list of projects and savings summaries that help generate the ROI on any project that we move forward with. It's really important that we build this muscle to drive important and to make sure that the results are sustainable year after year. Next slide. So now let's get into, what are we looking to measure and what are the criteria that will transform procurement to future-proof it against your future opportunities and distractions. Next slide. So we identified 8 areas that should be focused on and looked at. These include people, process, policies, and governance, commodity strategies, new opportunity sourcing, performance KPIs, procurement tools, project management, and supply risk management. We really focus on these 8 areas that drive value creation. And I'll go a little bit deeper into those in the following slides. So let's talk a little bit about people. It goes without saying, where is your team focused? Are they strategic or tactical? How much of them are strategic and how much of them are tactical? Both paths are needed within an organization, but to be frank with you, having very little strategic activity will only drive a lot of tactical tasks. So you really need to have that strategic outlook and view on what you're doing. And we define what that means in the assessment process. The next thing is having your team have the visibility and having regular reviews of their KPIs with their cross-functional partners, not only internally, but really the procurement team is a service organization within your enterprise. And having your cross-functional partners involved in those reviews and understanding the progress that's being made or the opportunities that are still remain is critical to a high-performing team. And the last 2 bullet points that are listed here are somewhat rudimentary to HR, but many times I find companies really don't have a formal process for training their procurement people in place. In addition to that, we all know how difficult it is to hold and keep good talent these days, especially in procurement. And it's so important that there is that formal professional development plan in place that can help retain your people to move forward within your organization. Next slide. Next, we want to look at policies and governance. And this, again, may seem very upfront and reasonable, but many organizations do not have an understanding of really what the procurement team does or what their scope is. And it's critical that this is documented and cross-functional partners look at this, understand it, and agree with it. And keep in mind, it's not really a dictatorial sort of view. It should be looked at as collaborative, but there should be guidelines and or rules that really guide the organization on how they treat things to be purchased. I think about how a procurement is treated in some ways, and in many organizations, you'll have HR or legal or engineering or manufacturing doing procurement functions, whether they be strategic or tactical. Now, you would never ask the HR department to do, manufacturing tasks or the engineering team to look at, legal contracts or legal to look at engineering and design a product. So it's kind of curious why we see that around procurement. And I really think because we don't have the teams and the cross-functional partners really don't have a good understanding of what procurement function is and what it does. And having that policy will certainly help alleviate some of those issues. And so the first 2 points are really looked at internally. But if you look at the last 2, these are really externally facing. And I can tell you with great experience that I've had amongst a number of companies, your internal T's and C's, terms and conditions, are we really holding our suppliers to that? Do we lead with that? Do our suppliers only say they have to use their terms and conditions? And that's certainly a bleed on the organization when we always constantly have to look at and deal with supplier terms and conditions. A simple question of who approves new suppliers? Can suppliers be added, throughout the organization without procurement involvement? Or is there a process that puts controls around that to make sure that we're only adding suppliers that meet our requirements? And then lastly, do we have agreed upon definitions for savings? I know this always tends to be a hot topic within organizations of, procurement says they've saved X, but I don't see it on the bottom line. So it's really important to have a agreement and understanding of how we define these savings, whether they be in inventory reductions, whether it be in true cost savings, whether it be any of the attributes that you may think about that procurement can help control and drive. And lastly, the takeaway here is really, does the organization know what the function of procurement is and does? Next slide. So, moving forward and getting a little bit deeper into, the pillars of what really drives a good procurement organization is commodity strategies. And it's really viewed as, how do we purchase a given commodity for your needs and for your company's requirements? And does the cross-functional partners within your organization, first of all, are they aware of it? Do they agree with it? And have they been part of creating that strategy? Having those three characteristics in a commodity strategy is vitally important to its success. And then furthermore, as we develop commodity strategies, do we have our significant spends under contract with some sort of protection against, whatever the situation may be, whether it be our suppliers being taken over or force majeure or things along those lines, or quality issues? Having those contracts in place as part of your commodity strategies is vitally important. Is there a strategy to incorporate global suppliers? I know in today's environment, there's a lot of companies looking to insource or let's say nearshore sourcing, as it's called, or bring things back from China. And that's okay, because we need to understand, what are the drivers and what is the strategy for your global supply chain. And then lastly, but probably the most critical aspect of this is within your commodity strategies is to understand the role of sole and single source suppliers. And are there mitigation plans in place if one of those suppliers should not be able to perform to what you need them to do? That really wraps up a view of commodity strategies. And, driving those strategies will drive efficiencies to your largest and most critical suppliers across the organization. Next slide, please. Thank you. So when we talk about new opportunity sourcing, and this may sound a little foreign to you, but it's really having the procurement team involved early. Is your procurement team involved, engaged early on in the product development cycle? So many times you see organizations where, the R&D department comes up with, very, good ideas, products, designs, drives it forward, gets to production, and then, we turn out that, wow, it's extremely difficult to source some aspect of that new product or new function within the product. So making sure that procurement team is engaged early in the organization and having that cadence to make sure that they have involvement is critical to the success of new product development. Secondly, CapEx projects. Many times CapEx projects are, let's say, put in a corner or handled only by a few people within the organization. At the end of the day, procurement is going to have to go negotiate, hopefully, with the potential suppliers for a CapEx project. And again, having them, being involved early, driving the specifications, understanding the marketplace for the suppliers is critical to really getting the most bang for your buck around CapEx projects. And then last, but certainly not least, as organizations do acquisitions, there always is an opportunity for procurement to drive value, but they really need to be engaged early in that process and have a playbook that describes the opportunities and how they're going to go after those opportunities within an acquisition. So really the key here in any of these topics here is that early involvement. And that's really the key to securing a large amount of value for the organization. Next, we're going to talk about procurement performance KPIs. There are a lot of organizations that have KPIs for cost, quality, and delivery and inventory. I get that. And many of them are good. But as I see in the practice, a lot of them aren't tied to specific actions or really can be looked at from a standpoint of what that definition, especially around cost and some of the things around delivery, is really looked at and agreed to across the organization. So it's important that that agreement is in place with your finance team as well as the other cross-functional partners. Many times, though, we see KPIs that are out there and aren't really reviewed on a regular basis, specifically with the cross-functional partners, because quite frankly, these KPIs should be directly tied to how their business is performing. And if it's not, then we need to refocus on what really those KPIs should be. And that really comes to the last point is, making sure that we are aligned and the procurement team is aligned with the strategic objectives with their KPIs. If inventory isn't an issue, then let's not look at that. Let's look at what really drives the strategic objectives within an organization. And, the last thought here is, of course, what you don't measure, it's very hard to improve. So you need to measure the things that you want to improve. You want to have agreement with those things, and you want to share them with your cross-functional partners to make sure that you're in line and continue to be in line with the strategic objectives. So as we move through the pillars, we can look at the procurement tools. And just like any other department or function within an organization, there is tools required for them to be able to perform at the highest level. Imagine an engineering team without some sort of design or CAD software, or the manufacturing team without the MRP or inventory system or something along those lines, or finance without some sort of financial accounting system that allows them to pull data. It's the same case with procurement. So does your organization have procurement data on harmonized spend? And what I mean by harmonized spend is, many times organizations can print out or spit out data on here's where we spend our money at. But many times you'll find, especially in organizations that have multiple locations, but not always, but those folks that have multiple locations or complex organizations where supplier adds and the control of suppliers into their ERP system isn't controlled, will have many different names. You may have companies, the same company that is just named with the company name. It may have the company name with incorporated. It may have the company name with Inc. after it, and all have different supplier or vendor codes in the system. And unless that data is harmonized, you could be missing opportunities to look at a larger spend across multiple locations. Next, is there a tool for procurement to use that allows them to use an online tool that allows for suppliers to compete for your business online tool? And like any tool, it's not used for everywhere. It's not meant to be used in every situation. But I can tell you from my experience, having a reverse auction tool and implementing it on about 10 to 15% of your spend will reduce that aspect of it by 20 to 25% year over year. And it is a remarkable opportunity to drive cost reduction. Next, as we look at, is there something that helps the procurement team drive the improvement in days payable outstanding, the terms to your supplier? Is there a tool for financing your suppliers or a credit card program that allows your suppliers or you to pay by credit card, hence getting a rebate and or improving your payment terms? Next, this is really important. Having a standardized and agreed upon total cost tool for your organization. Many times we look at just the cost or maybe just the logistical cost of getting product in. You really need to have that total cost to be able to understand the value to the organization two opportunities provide. And having that agreed to by your cross-functional partners is critical. Lastly, we'll talk within the procurement tools is is there a deployed supplier quality and risk assessment tools that are regularly reported on to the cross-functional partners? I did a complete webinar on this a couple of months ago that really described how this should work around risk assessment, risk mitigation, and supplier reaction. And this is obviously, in today's environment, probably one of the most critical aspects to your procurement tools and driving to make sure that you can bring in product regularly. And the parting thought here is tools are required to be most effective. Just like I mentioned earlier on, within any of the functional group, they have tools to drive and to be more efficient. It's no different with procurement. So as we look forward and we see things around how do we now affect those KPIs, and we have these tools in place and we start to create potential projects, it is really important that procurement team has a way to look through and have a project funnel that is kept current, is sufficient to meet or exceed the enterprise's expectations. And having a process or a standard work or cadence in place that certainly we can help you provide really needs to be in place to have a regular cadence on workshops, deep dives into the spend to drive that funnel to be able to meet the requirements. For projects in the procurement funnel, are there documented plans with clear owners and timelines? Many times I see in organizations, they have a very large funnel of projects. They say they're working on them, but as you dig deeper and pull back the layers of the onion, you find out that there's really not a good understanding or a plan with owners of the actions and timelines in place that will drive the projects to completion and affect the KPIs. So, overall, having a sufficient project funnel and a structured management process is a must to drive KPIs for the enterprise. Next slide. So I talked a little bit about the risk management as a tool, but it is so important that we feel that it is one of the pillars that drive and have a future-proof sort of view of your suppliers and your procurement organizations. And in more detail, and again, I did a complete webinar on this, but in summary, a lot of these things are you really looking at your risk assessment of your top and most critical suppliers regularly and coming up with tangible asset actions to reduce that risk? Are your top suppliers actually reviewed for quality and cost and delivery on a regular basis? Obviously, you're not going to be able to do this with all your suppliers, quite frankly, but you really need to focus in on where the ones that are going to drive the needle. Next is, are there a preferred supplier list that's managed by procurement that cross-functional teams adhere to? Now, that may seem fairly rudimentary, but I can tell you in my experience, and as I look at many companies, they will have a preferred supplier list, but it's only held by procurement. Cross-functional partners are not aware of that, especially if you think of engineering functions or R&D functions, or even in the manufacturing. They many times are looking to buy things and will go off in a tangent and not really follow what the strategy is and what the preferred list is that you have assembled to be able to drive the best outcome for a purchase. Lastly, as we look through things, as part of that risk assessment, do our largest suppliers have disaster recovery plans in place? Are we asking our largest and most critical suppliers, do they have disaster recovery plans in place? And do we have this documented to be able to go through this at a moment's notice, to be able to drive and to recover as quickly as possible when disasters strike? As I say here in the bottom as a takeaway, it's extremely difficult to predict disasters, but as we all know, it's much easier to prepare for them. So having that process and having that cadence in place is extremely important to really driving an effective procurement organization. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a case study in a company that I was involved with and led their procurement organization and transformed them actually into a high-performing organization. Next slide, please. So it was a medical device company. This company it was a highly siloed organization with procurement teams really not seen as providing a tremendous amount of value. They were a market leader in premium products with a global manufacturing presence. The big challenge was, throughout the multi-divisions of the business, they were highly decentralized with very few common practices and understanding of how the best way to do things across the organization. And some of the largest and most critical suppliers, we were considered a very minor customer to them as well. And quite frankly, there was a challenge given to myself and the team to come up with $125 million in savings over 10 quarters. So what we did and what I did with the organization was first deploy the assessment, understanding where we had the biggest opportunity to gain traction and to drive to the strategic initiatives. And then from there, it was really creating those improvement plans and standard processes across many of the different functions within procurement to drive improvement. Successfully installing reverse auction tool, developing commodity strategies that the organization agreed to and followed, supplier risk programs and spend visibility tools were also installed and helped drive that. And as a result of that, the outcome was meeting that target of driving over $100 million of savings within 10%, while reducing the procurement team by 35%. So there's a level of efficiency that also comes into this when you drive standardized tools across the organization. Next slide. So the next steps, if you're interested, or if this has piqued your interest in any way, is really to contact us. And next slide, Damon, is to schedule a procurement function rapid assessment. These typically take about 3.5 to 4.5 days, depending on the size of the organization. We will look at driving and really interviewing across the organization, not only the procurement leaders, but also the functional folks within the organization, as well as cross-functional partners to see how is procurement seen in the organization and where are the opportunities that they see from being outside of procurement and where opportunities can be driven to. As a result of this, we'll come back with this assessment deliverables that include, opportunities for improvement, a plan to go after them, as well as a project and ROI to drive the improvements. Next slide. So that really ends the view of the procurement organization. The upcoming webinars, which if you're interested, that Lean Focus is also putting on, are coming up actually tomorrow, one next week, and one in January, that have several different topics that might be interested to your organization. And last but not least, a quote by John F. Kennedy, which I really like, is, let us never negotiate out of fear, but let us fear not to negotiate, but let us never fear to negotiate. And really having that strategy and standard work and understanding of where we want to go will help us not to have that fear to negotiate. I'd like to thank all of you for attending today. And Damon, you can open it up for any questions that might be out there.
Thanks, Rob. Good job. So I have about 7 questions so far, and I'll just read them in the order that they were submitted. So Rob, the first question is, what sort of spend visibility tools does Lean Focus offer in conjunction with their consulting services?
So we've partnered with a company called Jagger. As we've looked across the industry, we did an extensive study as to what a company could provide the best tools within this space. And we feel that Jagger is one of those companies that can provide leading industry insight into your spend visibility.
Okay. The next question, Rob, what % of the material spend should a procurement organization be saving annually in your experience?
So, that's a little bit of an open-ended question, as you might expect, but it's a very good question. If a procurement organization is very far down on the scale of being an effective organization, those first couple of years of savings should be quite large, can be as much as 10%. But as on a year-over-year basis, once an organization is established with standard work and practices, it is very common to see 3, maybe 4% from cost savings opportunities, as well as value engineering activities for the organization.
Okay. Next question, how do you go about assessing supply chain risk? Can you explain more about the process here?
Sure. And as I mentioned, there is a webinar that is, I believe, captured on our website to be able to review that if you wish. Supplier risk assessment really requires, a cross-functional view. And what we look at is you want to look at how risky the supplier is across several attributes, as well as the impact to the business through several attributes, and then combining that with the revenue that the supplier can impact. In my experience, risk mitigation, which is really where the money is, right? To mitigate risk and not understand where your risk is important, but to mitigate, it's very expensive to mitigate risk fully and very time consuming. So it's very important to have a very prioritized view of your risk. And doing through an assessment process, as I described very briefly, will help you do that. And then driving to that mitigation activity that become projects in and out themselves, which either could mean, finding multiple sources, resourcing, perhaps equity stake in suppliers, inventory, those kinds of things that really drive, mitigation of risk. Now, for those suppliers that you can't get to or that are further down on the risk revenue score, as I like to call it, you really have to have those emergency reaction plans that aren't really mitigation, but if something does happen, you know what to do, meaning you know who the alternate suppliers are, you know who their distributors are to pull up inventory if they had a fire at their manufacturing facility and their supply chain is going to be interrupted for a period of time, or you know who their senior executives are to be able to contact them instantaneously, nearly when an emergency may occur. All of those things should be part of your emergency reaction plan, and again, should be written down and published in a place that allows for any of your procurement team to react very quickly when there is an emergency.
This is a Damon question. What would you say the top risk category is that you see time and time again inside of these clients when you do these assessments?
The biggest risk you typically see is really the single and sole source suppliers that the organization is not prepared or have the immediate capability to find an alternative. And I think that's probably the biggest, whether across all industry segments you see that. And that's really where you have the largest, and especially in regulated industries, whether it be aerospace or biomedical or something along those lines. When you have that single or sole source situation, that is what I see as the biggest risk to most organizations.
Okay, thank you. Next question submitted here. How frequently would you perform a reassessment to evaluate the progress that the procurement function has made?
I would think that would be yearly, but the key there is you're creating the KPIs in the organization that you should know how that progression is happening almost on a monthly basis. And to do a reassessment might be more of a problem solving of why you're not achieving your certain KPIs.
Got it. Next question, Rob. What are the top 3 process gaps that you typically see in procurement when you do this procurement function assessment?
The top 3 process gaps. I think first of all, the process gap that you would see, that I've seen in organizations is really that process around having the policies in place that drive understanding within the organization. I think that's number 1 of what procurement does. Number 2 is around the KPIs and having a good definition of what those KPIs and the process to monitor, to share, and react to KPIs that are not meeting expectations. And I think third is really project management around the procurement projects and project funnel, whether that be for savings or inventory reduction or quality improvement. Many times I've seen that there's all these great ideas, and again, there's a project funnel. We have an understanding of what projects we're working on, but no real project management of that and a process to drive it.
Okay, we have 3 more questions here. How do you prevent overemphasizing cost reduction at the expense of quality, inventory, lead time, etc.?
So, that's a great question. And I think that's often asked by many business leaders of, yes, I want cost reduction, but you can't sacrifice lead time or delivery or inventory or whatever it might be. So what it comes down to is those KPIs and having a balanced KPI scorecard that helps balance that out. In addition to that, looking at a total cost of ownership model, the TCO that I talked about before, will also help look at opportunities, because creating that model for your organization, things like inventory or potential quality aspects should be part of that TCO model when you make a supply selection.
Got it. What's the best way to get started with my organization, and how do I sell it internally?
So the best way obviously is to do that assessment, right? And to understand where you are today against world-class organizations, or aspirationally where you want to go. And how you can sell that is the return on investment and the projects that we can come out of that with cost, quality, or inventory or delivery improvement activities.
What's a typical ROI, Rob?
That's a fairly difficult question to ask, not knowing the size of the organization, the amount of spend and things along those lines. But typically we'll see anywhere from, the ROI being as little as 6 months to maybe being a year or so. But in many cases, the ROI to do this and the activity that we look at this, and again, Lean Focus doesn't bring in a team of people like some other folks to do this. We are really in a coaching mode and helping you develop your own processes and standard work to do these things. So our cost to do this is fairly low. And the savings that you could potentially see, as I mentioned before, even if you took the 3 to 4% of your total spend and you had a spend of $1 billion, the ROI is almost meaningless at that point in regards to the investment that you make into getting to world class.
Yep. Last question, how do you efficiently manage the indirect spend management decisions that are made in a large organization? So I think it has to do with functional leaders that bring in vendors and things, sort of bypassing procurement and not involving procurement.
So yeah, that's a very typical question we get when we look at an organization where they have silos out there or the cross-functional partners around, whether it be marketing, whether it be finance or legal or any of those types of disciplines that typically spend significant amount of money on indirect. It really comes down to having that procurement policy that drives the compliance of you shall do this when. And obviously, procurement can't do everything for the organization. And so there needs to be some reasonable expectations and limits that are incorporated into that policy around, what level of spend procurement will be engaged with. But in general, that's really where it starts, is having that viewpoint of how procurement is going to interact with those cross-functional partners. Then it becomes the next step to that is really to derive ownership of the spend to procurement and allow for the cross-functional partners to see the value of driving certain projects to help them reduce their costs so that they can spend more in other areas or reduce their budgets in general.
Yep. We had one more fly in here during that. Following the COVID crisis, did you find major shifts in the procurement process or supplier selection criteria taking into consideration this type of risk in the risk management plans? And if so, is it possible to share an example of those shifts?
Yes, there was definitely some shifts, and I talked a little bit about the sourcing, having a global supply strategy. Thinking about that around sourcing in low-cost countries and the percent of spend that you actually want to have there, or only single sourcing in a low-cost country has, really there's a tremendous shift going on to, yes, we can take advantage of some of that, but it's to a much less degree. And so making sure that is part of your risk analysis as you drive to a new source or look to a sourcing project, that is critical. And in the past, pre-COVID, there was certainly the continued drive to lower cost countries, to lower cost regions to help reduce costs. And in today's world, it really comes down to, in many ways, the availability and how to drive that availability to serve your customers. So definite shift, and that's one thing that when you do these risk assessments in your supply base, and you do that typically on a yearly cadence, you'll need to revisit that criteria that you judge your suppliers on based upon the current economic, social economic, and issues happening in the world today.
Yeah, I think Apple's a great example where the COVID lockdown and restrictions in China, alongside of sort of the human rights issues in the area where the iPhones are made and those kinds of things, like just death by 1,000 cuts over the years. I've read news where they're considering pulling out all iPhone production, moving into India, and are making those investments as an example based on kinds of things.
Yes, but I would certainly, let's say, not necessarily warn them against that, but bring up the view of, it shouldn't be an all or nothing view in today's world. India could suffer from very similar kinds of things anytime, so you need to be covered. You need to have a strategy that can deploy across several regions, especially the scope that you would think of as an Apple.
Yeah, so I think the point you're making is dilute the risk by creating degrees of freedom and not, the old adage, don't put all your eggs in one basket.
Exactly. Exactly.
Okay, so that concludes the Q&A. So I want to thank you for taking time to participate in this webinar. And as I mentioned in the introduction, this webinar will be made available in an audio and visual recording, which should land in your email that you signed up to register for the webinar for. And that should come in a day. If you do not receive that, please check your spam folder. Thank you. Thank you, Rob. Great job. We look forward to seeing all of you sometime in the future. Take care and happy holidays. Bye now.